Hi, I'm Blake. If you're looking for a quick intro about me, there's hopefully a short video on my channel that I've made since posting this video. Two quick prefaces before getting into today's video. I don't claim to be an authority on anything I discuss. I just enjoy reading and studying various topics. I will also try and link my script for this video in the links below. So this is episode 1 of a series I'm calling Book Battle, where I compare and contrast competing texts. Today our battle is going to be between Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus and Timothy Paul Jones's Misquoting Truth. Misquoting Truth is a rebuttal to Misquoting Jesus. I'm going to provide an overview of both books, give 3 main points of analysis, and discuss a quick bonus topic, and then provide my concluding thoughts. Let's get into today's battle. So, the author of Misquoting Jesus is Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is a University of North Carolina professor. He began his teaching career at Rutgers University and joined the faculty in the Department of Religious Studies at UNC in 1988, where he served as both the director of graduate studies and the chair of the Department of Religious Studies. His scholarly expertise includes fields such as the historical Jesus, the early Christian Apocrypha, the Apostolic Fathers, and the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Ehrman received both his Master's of Divinity and his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, where he studied under renowned New Testament scholar Bruce Metzger. It's hard to go very far in the world of modern study of Christianity or dive into the world of Christian apologetics without hearing about Bart Ehrman. Ehrman has conducted numerous debates with Christian apologists and scholars, and conversations with him can be found on YouTube channels like Alex O'Connor's. Misquoting Jesus is largely directed towards the general populace that has an interest in the texts of the New Testament, along with those in more strict fundamentalist Christian traditions who may be being exposed to new information. It is certainly a text meant to prompt further investigation into the topics discussed. Misquoting Jesus begins with a brief introduction about Bart's timeline and becoming interested in the text of the New Testament. Bart begins by discussing his process of becoming a born-again believer in his youth and having quite a rigid view of the New Testament, and the progressive changes in his perspectives as he attended institutions like Moody Bible Institute, Wheaton College, and Princeton Theological Seminary. This content is well distributed in Bart's works and works about Bart, so we won't go into too much detail here. Chapter 1 of Misquoting Jesus is the beginning of Christian scripture. This chapter provides an overview of the textual basis of the origins of Christianity, including what Ehrman describes as Christianity's bookish nature set against the context of the Greco-Roman world in which our New Testament text arose. This includes discussion of Christianity's relationship with Judaism, the structure of early Christian communities, the genres of early Christian writings, the establishment of Christian canons, or authoritative texts, and the various genres of early Christian writings such as Gospels, letters, apocalypses, apologies, and martyrologies. This chapter provides a backdrop for the rest of the book. Chapter 2 is copyist of the early Christian writings. In this chapter, Ehrman provides one of his major arguments in Misquoting Jesus, which is that the earliest Christian copyists of the New Testament text were more prone to errors and alterations than later scribes. Ehrman discusses how copying functioned in early Christian circles and the ancient world as a whole, as well as the nature of some of the changes made in the manuscript tradition. One of the most significant of the alterations is the last 12 verses of Mark's Gospel. We will come back to some crucial quotes in this chapter that further detail Ehrman's views on textual criticism later on in our analysis section. Chapter 3 is the text of the New Testament. Here, Ehrman discusses the progression in Christian history towards professional scribes copying the text of the New Testament. It also contains discussion about issues with the Textus Receptus, which would later be used for translation of the notorious King James Bible. There is more discussion about the impact of deistic thoughts on notions of inerrancy, and more examples of changes in the manuscript tradition. The one I would consider most worthy of mentioning here, the most worthy change, is the explicit reference to Trinitarian theology in 1 John 5:7-8, also known as a Johannine comma. Chapter 4 is The Quest for Origins, which details the methods and discoveries of a wide array of different New Testament textual critics and elaborates on how their theological perspectives impacted their approaches to New Testament criticism. This chapter probably had the most new information for me out of any chapters in Misquoting Jesus. Chapter 5 is Originals That Matter. Here we learn about how New Testament scholars evaluate internal and external evidence to evaluate what our original text or the earliest forms that we can attain to actually said. We learn about the sophisticated yet imprecise nature of New Testament textual criticism. Quite relevant to these discussions is also Ehrman's explanation of what is known as the synoptic problem, which is the literary interrelationships between our synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how that impacts the ways in which scholars assess the text. Chapter 6 is Theologically Motivated Alterations of the Text, my favorite chapter. Here we learn about competition between various sects in the early history of Christianity. These include early Christian adoptionists, docetists, and separationists. This chapter begins to illuminate the historical context that impacted the manuscript traditions, which is further detailed in the next chapter. Chapter 7 is the social worlds of the texts. Again, we learn about the historical contexts that have impacted our manuscript tradition. However, it's important to note here that Ehrman does stipulate that the copying of early Christian texts was by and large a conservative process. The scribes, whether non-professionals, scribes in the early centuries of Christianity or professional scribes of the Middle Ages, were intent on conserving the textual tradition that they were passing on. The three main categories of historical considerations that impacted our text are women's roles in the church, Jews and Christians in conflict, and pagan and Christians in conflict. Chapter 8 is Conclusion, Changing Scripture. There's a quote on page 215 in reference to the scribes who provided our New Testament text that encapsulates this final chapter well. Quote, each of these authors was human. Each of them had a different message. Each of them was putting the tradition he inherited into his own words. Each of them, in a sense, was changing the texts he inherited. Now on to our rebuttal to Ehrman, Timothy Paul Jones's Misquoting Truth. So Timothy Paul Jones is the Vice President for Doctoral Studies and Chair of the Department of Apologetics, Ethics, and Philosophy at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, where he also has his PhD in philosophy. TPJ, as I will refer to him for the rest of the video, also holds degrees in Biblical Studies and a Master's of Divinity with a focus on church history and New Testament studies. He runs an apologetics website where you can find more of his work. And I'll try and link that as well. The link's below. So this book is written for a believer that has either read Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus or heard of Bart Ehrman in general and may have become concerned. And more the latter, as I will argue later. TPJ expresses in the footnotes on page 157 of Misquoting Truth that this book is intended for lay people. Another quick note of context before diving into the contents of this book: all professors of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary must adhere to the seminary's abstract principles, which holds that the scripture of the Old and New Testaments were given by inspiration of God and are the only sufficient, certain, and authoritative rule of all saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. And the president of the seminary, Albert Mohler, holds the doctrine of inerrancy articulated in the 1978 Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, which states that Scripture, having been given by divine inspiration, is infallible, so that, far from misleading us, it is true and reliable in all matters it addresses. We deny that it is possible for the Bible to be at the same time infallible and errant in its assertions. Infallibility and inerrancy may be distinguished but not separated. End quote. Providing this context about the seminary is not an attempt to poison the well, but it would be quite naive to not believe that these doctrinal considerations don't influence the perspective provided in the rebuttal. Okay, a lot of preface there. Getting into the text now. The introduction of Misquoting Truth begins, as do all of the following chapters, with a quote from Ehrman. The intro contains a brief discussion of Bart Ehrman and his views, and then segues into providing a similar testimony that parallels the introduction that is provided in Misquoting Jesus, with an anecdote about TPJ beginning to question his faith as he began at Bible college. However, TPJ's questioning causes him to reach drastically different conclusions than Ehrman. This parallel by TPJ is a nice literary touch. TPJ states two of the main claims of his book in this section, that points of textual uncertainty don't undermine Christian faith, and evaluation of the historicity of New Testament texts can lead one to develop a pattern of faithful trust as opposed to blind faith. Chapter 1 is the truth about originals that matter. The chapter begins by outlining TPJ's notions of biblical inerrancy, and then takes issues with Ehrman's supposedly erroneous understanding of what God's inerrant word means. TPJ states that the problem with Ehrman's line of reasoning is that, quote, the inspired truth of Scripture does not depend on word-for-word agreement among all biblical manuscripts or between parallel accounts of the same event. His view is that, instead, the question should be, though they may have been imperfectly copied at times and though different writers may have described the same events in different ways, do the biblical texts that are available to us provide sufficient testimony for us to understand God's inspired truth? In other words, supposing that God did inspire the original New Testament writings and that he protected those writings from error, are the available copies of the New Testament manuscripts sufficiently accurate for us to grasp the truth that God intended in the first century? We will discuss some of the unfounded implicit assumptions made here in the analysis section later on. TPJ then begins to discuss what access and use of manuscripts would have looked like in the early decades of Christianity, which is then followed up with in Chapter 2, the truth about the copyists. Chapter 2 dives deeper into disagreements with Ehrman's assessment of the manuscript data. TPJ argues that Ehrman doesn't clearly communicate the vast insignificance of the majority of New Testament variants. TPJ also promotes confidence that use of textual critical methods allows scholars to determine the original form of the text. This is a key disagreement between authors that we will elaborate on later. Chapter 3 is truth about significant changes in the New Testament. TPJ begins the chapter, as he does with some of the other chapters, by providing a silly metaphor to illustrate to the reader how modern copying of information differs from the circumstances of copying in ancient Christianity. TPJ reiterates his claim that there are no significant alterations to the text that would cause a Christian to rethink a vital belief of doubt. Would cause a Christian to rethink a vital belief in the historical accuracy of the New Testament, and that any alteration that's found in the manuscript tradition can still be found as truth in another part of New Testament texts. For example, in Misquoting Jesus, Ehrman discusses an alteration found in 1 Timothy 3:16 that Ehrman views as being theologically motivated, the alteration that is, to establish Jesus' divinity. However, TPJ asserts that even if we acknowledge this alteration, we have substantiation of Jesus' divinity in Philippians and in Colossians. So there is no conflict to Christian belief. Numerous other examples in this vein are provided. Chapter 4 is truth about misquoting Jesus. Once again, many of the specific alterations in the manuscripts mentioned in Misquoting Jesus are discussed. Once again, TPJ disagrees very little with the actual changes that have occurred in the manuscript tradition, just disagrees with Ehrman's interpretation of the relevance and motivations behind the changes. Chapter 5 is Truth about Oral History, where TPJ takes a more favorable view of the reliability of oral history than a scholar like Ehrman. This chapter seems to be addressing much of Ehrman's work outside of Misquoting Jesus, which is going to be common throughout the second half of Misquoting Truth. Chapter 6 is Truth about the authors of the Gospels. Again, this chapter isn't so much related to Misquoting Jesus as it is a response to Ehrman's overall work/views. TPJ attempts to establish traditional authorship claims of the Gospels, using testimony from church fathers such as Papias and Irenaeus, along with belief about oral tradition that accompanied the distribution of the texts. However, TPJ does attempt to stipulate that the historical accuracy of the New Testament does not depend on determining who wrote it, and does concede that the first copies of the Gospels may have been anonymous, although accompanied with oral tradition. Chapter 7 is Truth about Eyewitness Testimony. Again, we have a silly metaphor attempting to liken one's knowledge and their fact that they're born to obtaining historical knowledge. Further analysis of church fathers dating the New Testament texts and the capacity for authorship of Jesus' disciples / those linked to the disciples is discussed. Chapter 8 is Truth about How the Books Were Chosen, where TPJ establishes a view of Christian canonicity and the level of scrutiny applied in the decisions of determining the canon. And this is Timothy Paul Jones views the level of scrutiny applied to be much more rigorous than how Ehrman views it. Again, this isn't super related to Misquoting Jesus itself, but rather Ehrman's views overall. Finally, we have concluding remarks. This quote encapsulates TPJ's rebuttal of Ehrman pretty well. Quote, "It appears to me that the problem was not that he, Ehrman, peered too deeply into the origins of Christian faith. It was that he inherited a theological system from well-meaning evangelical Christians that allowed little, if any, source for questioning variations or rough edges. TPJ ultimately," end quote. TPJ ultimately believes that Christianity fits the lock, as he puts it, answering life's greatest questions.